All right, so today we'll start with a microevolution and we'll move on to a larger scale macroevolution, and then we'll talk about how geology affects the biology and vice versa. So first of all, the classification overall. We already kind of discussed that. You already seen similar things, probably. So basically some sort of ancestral cells. Ancestral cells, basically eukaryotic cells, which are somehow ended up on that particular planet. There is several major theories about that. None of them are completely answer all of the questions. One of the easiest ones is basically the bacteria has been brought down by some sort of meteorite. The question is how the bacteria got on that particular meteorite. And then, of course, it's ended up somewhere in the ocean, and then lots of nutrients, and the bacteria start consuming, and then start changing, evolving, so to speak, unfolding, and we ended up with the domain bacteria, domain archaea, and then domain eukarya. We already talked about several. I told you we have like 4 major kingdoms, and we already Protista as well as the algae are kind of combined together. That's why 4. Then there is the plants, animals, and fungi. As a matter of fact, this week we'll start on the plants. So, but the Protista is kind of collecting group. Remember, I was telling you that if it's not 100% plant, animal, or fungi, it goes right now into that particular group known as the Protista. That's one of those particular tree of life. There is a little bit more detailed one, but once again, earliest cell somewhere around 4.5, probably closer, well, maybe 4.5, 4.2 billions of years. Basically, as soon as Earth cool off enough, well, basically to like about 100 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, we start seeing the presence of life, and then it starts diversifying, and you can see the bunch of different protists. Today this week and a couple of next couple of weeks, we'll talk about the seedless plants, seeded plants, flowering plants, all that particular stuff, and then we'll already talk about the fungi, and then we'll talk about the animals next unit. All right, so that's a little bit more complex. And once again, look, in this particular case, archaean bacteria, eukaryotes, and then we have prokaryotes and eukarya, pretty much everything else. There was several students who still believe that if it's a single cell organism like a protist, like a euglena or diatom or amoeba, it's a eukaryote, it's a prokaryotic organism. No, they're not prokaryotes, they're actually eukaryotes. They have the nucleus and membrane bound organelles, so they are quite complex. That's the answer on the short answer. And then there is another very interesting thing which shows pretty much the same tree, but now we have the cross section, something which known as the interspecies or intergroup moving of the genes. DNA from bacteria has been embedded into some of the animals, into some of the fungi, plants. You probably heard about genetically modified organisms, right? GMO, bad. We don't really know. We actually are the guinea pigs for the genetically modified produce. We don't know the long term of the GMO. So, but it happens in the nature. Now we are copying the nature, and we can take the gene from, let's say, a flounder and stick it into the potato. You can say, why do we need to take the flounder or shellfish and stick it into a potato or tomato? Well, apparently it will not make, well, it will make those particular genetically modified organisms, potatoes and tomatoes, bad tasted for the pests. Pests will avoid that. Like, hey, weird tasting potato, I'll go away. But it's actually happened. Now we're doing it artificially, but it happened on multiple occasions, horizontal gene transfer, so to speak, from one group to another, such as chloroplasts. Remember, chloroplasts probably were free-living bacteria. Mitochondria has been free-living bacteria which been absorbed by the larger cell. Anyway, so now evolution. Again, evolution is the process. Process of what? Of changing genetic frequencies or genetic makeup of the population from generation to generation. This is the definition I'm looking for when I'm asking you about biological evolution. Just saying change. Change of what? Change of genetic or process of changing the genetic makeup or genetic frequencies of the population from generation to generation. We already discussed that multiple times, and this is what I'm looking for. Now, again, you will see that that particular question, biological evolution, pretty much every single time on the test, lab practical or the lecture test. Now, in this particular case, what exactly? I will be always looking for some sort of examples. I gave you several examples. I'll talk about several examples today as well. And again, theory of evolution has quite a large amount of evidence. We discussed some of those evidence before. And one of the problems is it does not really explain origin of life on Earth. We don't know how it started. We really don't. Once again, some of the scientists saying the meteorite brought in, but it's basically how the bacteria got on the meteorite. Some of the scientists saying that over a period of time, enough of the chemicals got together and they started that particular process of life. Maybe, maybe not. Well, there is a divine intervention, of course. Couple of years ago, I was traveling through California national parks, like, you know, Sequoia National Park, and we were staying in Yosemite, and there was quite a strange guy, even to the California standards, next to us, and we got talking, and he was teaching at the local college as well, and he told, oh yeah, I know how the life started. And I'm like, how? He's like, extraterrestrials were flying on the flying saucer. I'm like, yes, that's a good idea, yes. And he's like, and they decided to stop by on that particular rock, you know, kind of have a little picnic, and then one of them either vomited or spit into the ocean, and this is how the bacteria were introduced to the new planet. I'm like, well, yeah, that's an interesting theory, not too much foundation. Well, I mean, the evidence of that, but yeah, hey, maybe it happened, yes. And we are just evolution of the extraterrestrial vomit or spit. Anyway, so what evolution does, it describes how the organism changed. Remember, changing in genetic makeup, small changes over a period of time, and we'll talk about that, about the macroevolution, results in all kinds of different forms and shapes, creating the biodiversity we're observing nowadays. All right. So evolution does not affect all of the aspects. On one hand, this is according to modern theory or synthesized theory of evolution. However, we already talked about the bat, right? Remember? Squeaky voice, well, high-pitched voice, so to speak. If it's just by itself, there is no advantage. It have to develop a special ears, have to develop a special part of the brain, and so on and so forth. So in this particular case, there is some of the issues. That's the reason why evolution is a theory. One of the things that quite often nature, God, if you wish, within the evolution does repurpose some of the things. Like, for example, before the birds start flying, the ancestors, basically dinosaurs, already had a wishbone, and then it was a repurposed so the muscles can get kind of attached to that. the flying mussels, of course. Now, God and the evolution, I specifically use that. In the beginning of 2000s, somewhere in that area, the the head of Catholic Church, a Pope, come out and says, yes, evolution, well, I'm paraphrasing, but the general idea is evolution does happen, the change within the living creatures, it's been proven, but it's all according to God's design. And that's fine. He just provided the one of the possible mechanisms of the evolution. The problem, once again, we can observe the evolution, why it's a theory, because we don't know all of the mechanisms of the evolution. We cannot answer that just yet. So anyway, we'll talk about the phylogeny. Phylogeny is who is related to whom, and you did the cladogram assignment for that. And then, of course, in that particular cladogram assignment, you can observe some of the evolutionary trends. Like, well, 4 legs, that's a trend for the terrestrial creatures. All of them, all of us ended up with the 4 legs. Amphibians started, we still have the 4 legs. You're grabbing the, let's say, a frog and counting how many toes it has, guess what? 5. Now, why some of the organisms, like let's say some of the dinosaurs as well as the birds, have less, like 3, for example? Well, once again, as long as it's not disrupting the evolution overall, the number of the limbs will stay the same. But now think about it. Our pinky is already much smaller than, let's say, the pointy fingers and so on. So they're slowly reducing in size, and at some point of time, we probably will end up with 3 again, because you can text and do pretty much everything with only 3 fingers. All right, so natural selection. Remember that particular statement, survival of the fittest, is not entirely correct. Surviving is important, but if you didn't reproduce, that's it. And this is where the biological species come, the definition of the biological species come into a place. Remember what biological species are? A population of the organisms capable of interbreeding. Interbreeding is one very important step, but also produce fertile offspring. Some of you, when you are writing that particular answer down, biological species, capable of interbreeding, and you stop. No, don't stop. Continue. Produce fertile offspring. Very, very important. Because if it's an infertile offspring, the next generation, all of those fitted things would be gone, literally destroyed. They will die off with the carrier, so to speak. So be very careful on that. And once again, the biological species, that particular, with the examples, plural, right? Make sure that you will be able to provide some of the examples. Wolves, coyotes, we are coyote, right? In the college, that's the mascot. And then there is the ravens, and then there is the alligators. I think it's a Norse one. Anybody knows what's the mascot of the new one, the Generation Park? Anybody? I have no idea. I honestly don't. So, survival of the fittest, even though Darwin proposed it, it's slightly misleading. Sometimes smallest is easier to conceal and survive. Sometimes the biggest one will not be able to reproduce. Therefore, not only survival, but also the reproduction. And then, of course, sexual selection. We talk about the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Remember all of those particular 5 major traits in order, or conditions for the equilibrium to be. It most likely will be on the lab practical, so refresh your memory on that. And yeah, there is none real world population which is in equilibrium, none whatsoever. It's a theoretical model for us to use it against the actual data in the field, so to speak. So we can say, yes, the genetic frequency is changing. Yes, evolution taking place. So yes, sexual selection is a special type of natural selection. By that, we're talking about random versus non-random mating. For the equilibrium to be, it have to be a random mating. Sexual selection means that there will be a preferences. All right, so several types of natural selection. One of them is a stabilizing natural selection. Stabilizing natural selection are favoriting the medium, the average. That's basically average phenotype is favored, and in this particular picture, it shows you the number of eggs in the clutch. So if it's only one egg, then there will be not enough offsprings to carry on. If there is like 10 of eggs in the clutch, there will be, well, some of them will die off from not being properly heated. So the average is good. Now, directional selection, and we'll talk about that. And that's a really, it's kind of iconic example of the evolution. And it's also example of the process of evolution. So what exactly we have? This is the original population, peppered moth. Peppered moth is the butterfly kind of type of the creature which active during the night. During the day, it sits, literally sitting down on the bark of the trees. And because of its speckled pattern, it's kind of hard for the predators to see. In the late 1800s, in some of the areas of Great Britain, scientists noticed that they start seeing much more darker variety than the original one. And they said, why in the world we start seeing the darker versions? Not everywhere, in the particular spots. So they start figuring it out, and what they ended up with, that in the areas which are heavily polluted by the soot, industrial revolution, right? Burning coal to produce energy. Whenever you're burning coal, the soot comes out, and then it settles down in the environment, including the bark of the trees. Now, over a couple of decades, we start seeing the tree bark, the color, change drastically because of all of that particular soot. It's become darker. So the darker variety has the ability to conceal itself better. It conceals itself better. It will be able to reproduce, produce viable offspring. And here we go. The next generation will start seeing the darker variety prevailing, so to speak, and further on. And then there is a diversifying selection. Diversifying selection, it's kind of opposite of stabilizing selection. Stabilizing goes for the means, the averages. The stabilizing goes for the other ends. In this particular case, we have the original population, and then we have the speckled bunny, and then the darker bunny. So those ones would have the lower probability of not only survive but producing the offsprings, and that one will have a higher. Why? Where? Rocky environment. You can see on the rocks, well, the predator will see on the rocks the white bunny very, very easily, right? So rabbits. The gray ones will be blending in better. On that one, for example, it's a snow fields where you have rocks and the snow. That one will be able to conceal itself better. As a result, we're looking at the selection is favoriting the outsides, and then of course those particular bunnies over a period of time, and those bunnies will separate. There will be a geographical barrier between them, and then eventually they'll become close related species. The next picture, here we go. We're looking at the normal peppered moth and the darker variety on the sooted bark of the tree. So in this particular case, if I'm a bird, the predator, I will see that one much easier from afar than this guy. Therefore, that one will be eaten, that one will conceal itself, will be able to reproduce, producing more darker varieties, right? So here we go. That's example of what? Of the evolution. Peppered moth, darker variety. So here we have several major trends in the hybrid zones. Remember, the population splitting apart. They are still the same species, but they are splitting. There might be some sort of geographical barrier between them, maybe some behavioral or anything like that. Three possibilities. First of all, the populations are splitting, and then over a period of time, the hybrids are created. By over a period of time, less and less hybrids will be created. Therefore, eventually we'll end up with two new species. It's called reinforcement, because it's reinforcing the natural selection and essentially the process of evolution. Now, a speciation, a process of formation of the new species. Now, fusion, we start with two populations and then they merge back for one or another reason. So now speciation basically stopped. They start exchanging the genes very nicely, and here we go. We continue to have one species. And then the stability. We have population number one, population number two going into a species number one, species number two, each one of those producing the hybrids. Hybrids continue to produce, but quite often hybrids will start interacting within the hybrid, so to speak, and therefore you might end up eventually with a third species, which will be related to both of those newly species. And of course, time is always the requirement. So here we go. The macroevolution, large scale, starting with, again, microevolution, talking about the genetic changes in the genetic frequencies within the population. Everything above the population, species, genus, etc., that would be a macroevolution. So essentially, remember, mutations. Essentially, we're taking those particular equilibrium conditions, saying no to their mutations, no mutations, no gene flow, no gene flow, no natural selection. Now we have a natural selection. All of those conditions plus quite a large amount of time, 4.2 to 3.8 billions of years. And now we're looking at the evolution on the grand scale, macroevolution. All right. So geological scale. This is kind of a little bit of geology. My background is also in geology. I have a zoology and geology background. I have masters in geology, used to teach geology at the St. Jack. But if we look, you don't have to memorize. I'll show you several major things in here, but pre-Archean. Archean means ancient one, archaic. Pre-Archean, that's basically before the life started, essentially. Archean and Proterozoic, we start seeing the life, some of the signs of the life, but mostly it was either a bacterial one, so prokaryotic, somewhere around here, most likely we start seeing eukaryotic cells, but everything was on a single cell level, so not much of the fossils remain. Soft tissues generally do not preserve too well, all right? Now here, look at this particular period known as the Cambrian period. Roughly 550 millions of years ago, we start seeing something which is known as a Cambrian explosion, explosion of life, different shapes, different forms. As a matter of fact, out of 40 plus phylum of modern organisms, about 80%, excuse me, 80% can be traced back to the Cambrian. And that's known as the Paleozoic, ancient life. Everything going right here, we'll talk about the Carboniferous era. This is where we start seeing the increase of the land plants. They started somewhere in Silurian, maybe Ordovician, and then, but they explode, specifically the ferns, in the Carboniferous period, and then they start dying off, creating whatever the coal reserves we have right now. And then we'll talk about something which is known as the Permian. In the Permian extinction, that between the Mesozoic and Paleozoic, we had one of the huge extinctions, probably the worst one, meaning that there was a specific conditions on Earth, specifically there was a supervolcano, most likely. A supervolcano was erupting. It was a fissure volcano, means a crack in the land for about 1,000 miles long. And it was well, it was erupting for about 1 million or so years, filling up the atmosphere with the toxic gases. As a result, about like 90% of the marine life died off. We were very close to, well, the life were very close to be killed during that particular time. And then, well, there was a few other, we'll talk about a few other extinctions, but Permian was one of the largest ones. And then after the Permian, we start seeing the race of the dinosaurs. Everything was good until 65 millions of years ago, where something happened. We had another mass extinction, and most likely it was the meteorite plus supervolcanoes, any combination of that. And then we start seeing the rise of the mammals. So we'll talk a little bit about that. That's quite interesting, how geological events shaping the diversity of life. So here's the geological scale. Again, Earth formed about 4.6 billions of years ago, first life somewhere around 4 billions of years ago. And then we start seeing, as you can see, 4 billions of years, first life, single cell organisms. Nothing really happened until 550, 560 millions of years ago, when we start seeing a huge explosion of the diversification of life. And that happened relatively fast, within only 60 millions of years. Again, we're talking about billions of years within evolution. And then, of course, we start seeing first fish, and then first land plants, and then, of course, the first dinosaurs. The first mammals arrived on this particular, evolved on this particular Earth around 215, 200 millions of years ago. So they kind of were evolving in the shadow of the dinosaurs. Then the extinction of the dinosaurs with the following proliferation of the mammals. You already seen that particular picture, kind of gives you all of those ones in a nice circular kind of pie graph scale. So a law of superpositioning. If you're ever interested in any kind of rocks, and you can see I have several of them on the background. Once again, I was teaching geology. Law of superposition is one of the crucial laws. Now it's a law, it's not a theory, in geology. And this is one of my favorite, one of the favorite national parks in the United States, called the Zion. Oh no, it's not Zion. It's right next to the Zion National Park, about 3 hours up north. That one is a Bryce Canyon. A really, really beautiful place. And you can see the law of superposition here very nicely. You can see the layers, different layers on that particular canyon. And the deeper the layer, the older it is. That's all the law of superposition says, that in the ocean, whatever settles on the bottom, whatever is on top is younger than whatever is on the bottom. That's pretty much it. So rock layers deposit on top of the layers were already there, meaning they are older. How it's applied to the biology. See, that one is the oldest one, this is the youngest one, and you can say that that particular layer is younger or more recent than this particular layer, but this layer is more recent than that one. So we can do some sort of relative dating. We can say this is the youngest one, this is the medium one, this is the oldest one. So now if we use the creatures in there, we'll look for the fossils, we can say that those guys, the trilobites, are older than those guys. They are something which is known as the brachiopods, but brachiopods are older than the eurypterids, sea scorpions, and the sea scorpions are older than the nautiloids. Kind of makes sense? Also, there is another law in, well, it's not the law, is a rule of thumb in geology, that we generally cannot date accurately sedimentary rocks. There is several types of the rocks. There is a hard rock, right? No, there is igneous rocks, sedimentary rocks, and metamorphic rocks. So we cannot date metamorphic rocks accurately, and we cannot date the sedimentary rocks accurately, but we can do the the igneous rocks relatively easily using the different radiometric dating. So in this particular case, one of the types of the igneous rocks, like volcanic ash or volcanic flow, like a lava flows, those ones we can date pretty accurately. As a result, we can say, well, this is a lava flow or volcanic ash, which is 468 millions of years. So everything above that will be younger than 468 millions of years. Everything which is below will be older. Now look, here we had two layers of igneous rocks. One of them is dating 468, another 470, and the layer in between we can say pretty close that those guys somewhere between 468 to 470 millions of years old. Easily. Easy, right? So plate tectonics. That particular gentleman, Alfred Wegener, come up with the crazy at his time an idea. He actually in 1912 he published a paper. He said, guys, continents are moving. And everybody's like, what are you smoking, man? And he's like, no, I'm telling you that Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, as well as India at some point of time were a huge continent. He actually called it Pangea. Pan means all, Ga means earth. All earth was a one huge supercontinent, and then it broke down. And they're like, how in the world the continents are moving? And he's like, I don't know. I just kind of noticed that the it's actually, well, first of all, the outlines of the continents, tectonic plates are matching, and second of all, we can match the specific fossils. Like for example, there is a particular fossil of kind of relatively large land reptile. Think about huge lizard. It's not a lizard, but you can find it in Africa, in the specific areas in Africa, kind of Central Africa, as well as the central of South America, not Central America, but central part of South America. And there was no, at the same levels, at the same type of the rocks, and there was no explanation how in the world the same species of the same reptile were able to move between two huge continents, until that particular gentleman says, well, at some point of time they were connected, and therefore the reptiles didn't have to swim through the Atlantic Ocean. It just it was a single continent. Same thing, we're looking at the another land reptile, and that one, something which known as a Glossopteris, will see that particular that's known as the fern, tongue fern, and that particular tongue fern fossils you will see during one of our labs later on in botany. So he could not explain. Now we still kind of, it's a theory, we think that the plates are kind of floating on top of the mantle or on top of the magma, and they slowly moving. Now we do have the evidence that the plates are moving, but they are moving very, very slow. Like for example, right now North American plate with a whooping speed of 1 inch a year goes toward the Asia, and eventually they will collapse. Yay! So if you are decide, it will take a couple of millions, but if you'll decide a couple of millions from now, decide to, let's say, invest in Japanese real estate market, it's not really a good idea. Why not? Because, well, Japan, islands of Japan is right in between two continents which will be colliding. And of course, there will be like all volcanoes coming out, the Godzilla will come out, all that particular stuff, total destruction, all these things. Well, and this is what happens actually with India. India, not as a country, but the continental plate. It starts moving and then eventually it collapsed, or it's collided with the Asian continental plate, and they start raising up. Now we have the highest mountains in the entire world known as the Himalayas because of the collision of two of those plates. And that's explained why, for example, if you're going 8,000 meters above the sea level, you know, one of the highest mountains in the world, you will be able to find literally a sea creature fossils on top of the Everest, well, under the snow, under the ice. If you look, if you'll get into the into the rocks, you will see some of the rocks might contain sea creatures. How in the world on the top of the world we ended up with the sea creatures? Well, because it brought it up during the collision. Some of the sediments has been raised up by the collision. Anyway, yes, and Howard Hess as well as the dates come up with that particular idea. We have the mantle, asthenosphere. Asthenosphere is moving slowly, and this is what creates the movement of the continent. As a matter of fact, asthenosphere, mid-oceanic ridge, creating the oceanic plate, and we're talking about much more in the geology about that. So if you're interested, we are still offering a physical geology, which I liked, but I was much more interested in the historical geology. After all, it's my background. Historical geology was quite a fun class. I'm not sure if they're still offering it at the, well, every semester at the South Park. So let's kind of take a look. We have, I need to remember how to, I think this, somewhere in the controls. Oh, here we go. So what you will be looking at is like 500 millions of years of movement of the continents in less than like 15 seconds. So let's kind of see how the continents, those particular pesky ones, were moving in the last. Hold on, let me get the part out. There we go. So let's kind of slowly see. Say Pangea, and then it splits up. Very interesting part. Somewhere right here, you can see that about 300 or so millions of years ago, we had a very huge continent with a very large seaside or ocean side. So it was wet and warm environment during that particular time, which will give a rise of for the plants, and we'll talk about the something which is known as the Carboniferous period. So here we have a Jurassic Park, just kind of Jurassic period. You probably heard Jurassic Park. Again, we have kind of a single continent which start breaking down slowly because of that particular movement. And again, continues even until now. The Horn of Africa is actually moving away from the Africa. That's why we have a Rift Valley right there. And few millions of years, it will be filled up with the ocean. Well, with this with the salt water, essentially ocean, and so on and so forth. Now, marsupials, let's say the orange distribution of the marsupials. At some point of time, they were quite nicely populating the area of modern South America, Antarctica, and then of course Australia and Oceania. Whenever it splits, it stays, the marsupial stays on the South America. Well, they start dying off here because of the cold conditions, and they stayed in Australia. Later on, whenever we ended up with the bridge between the North America and South America, we'll see that some of the marsupials actually moved into the North America. Most of the marsupials has been eliminated by the placental mammals in both of the Americas. Which marsupial we're talking about? Opossums. Opossums are the only marsupials which is, as far as I know, which can be found under natural circumstances outside of the Australia and Oceania. Most of it, of course, stays, and you see Australia stayed quite isolated, so most of the marsupials survived there. Now, fossils as the evidence, we already talked about that. Generally, fossils is sedimentary rocks. Fossils are very rare occurrence. So the fossil record is incomplete. Why it's a rare occurrence? Because the conditions have to be perfect. Usually, remember, the bacteria and fungi are recyclers, the decomposers. So as soon as something dies, the bacteria and the fungi will start breaking it apart, unless it will end up somewhere in the deep clay, surrounded, that there is no much of the bacterial fungi there, and then it might stay preserved. And I have several fossils. Let's see, here we go. And quite often you will see that on the hard parts of the fossil will be preserved, right? In this particular case, the shell. The soft tissues sometimes do being preserved, sometimes not. That's the interesting one. The rock known as a coprolite. Copros means feces, litos means rock. That's the fossilized pieces. Yes, so yes, sometimes that happens as well, but in most of the cases we're looking at the hard parts like the shells, etc. And sometimes, of course, tracks. We have a dinosaur tracks in Texas State Park, not far from Dallas. So fossils, besides that, just we can see that different organisms were populating the Earth at some point of time, helps us understand how the life forms and how they are related. We know that the modern birds are some sort of dinosaurs. They evolved from the dinosaurs, not T-Rex directly, but from the same group which T-Rex belonged to, as well as the Velociraptors. Also, we can talk about the climate. Really well, we can say, well, the climate is why, because we know, like some of the organisms, like for example, let's say we know that at some point of time Antarctica was a very lush continent with very a continent with a very large forests. So in this particular case, pretty much tropical forest, because we know that there is some fossils of the tropical plants. Not anymore, but at some point of time. So as well as ecology, and based on whatever we see in the modern creatures, we can infer the physiology as well as the behavior. For example, let me find that particular. Do I have that rock here? Oh, no, I don't have. Should have it. No, I don't have it. But right now we are thinking that some of the dinosaurs are most likely, not all, but some of them were warm-blooded creatures. Why? Because of the structures of the bones. They are very similar to whatever the mammals as well as the birds, the warm-blooded creatures of modern times have. Therefore, we can infer that most likely some of them were warm-blooded creatures. And of course, based on whatever we see in the fossils, we can infer as the behavior. For example, dinosaurs most likely had some of the parental care, meaning that they had some sort of huge nests with the eggs, and then there will be a couple of adults basically protecting those nests. Same idea as we have for the modern birds. Now, patterns, and here we have a very interesting things. Stasis. Stasis means that at some point of time the creature were evolving, everything was good, and then for one or another reason, and we don't know reason, and that's one of the problems with the evolution, we cannot explain it yet. The species do not change much, if at all. For example, you can see that particular weird-looking fish known as a Latimeria or coelacanth. Coelacanth was well known since 1800s as its fossil form. It's something which known as a lobe-fin fish. That's a group of fish most likely give us the link to the modern theropods, including amphibians, reptiles, and the birds and the mammals. But in this particular case, that particular fish, we had a really good fossil record of those. And then in 1930s, one of the ladies in the South Africa, the east coast of South Africa, found in a catch of the day, she found a weird-looking fish. Unfortunately, she was unable to preserve it initially, but she was able to draw out, draw the outlines of the fish, and then she sent it via mail, regular, not emails, via mail to her friend, like a couple of 100 miles away, who was an avid ichthyologist, and he said, you are on something, get another one, and this is get another sample, and this is how you need to preserve. And that particular fossil at some point of time was rediscovered as the living creature. So those ones are known as the living fossils. We'll talk about those, meaning that that particular creature did not evolve for the last 300 or so millions of years, 250. Same thing with the horseshoe crab. Later on, we'll talk about the horseshoe crab. It did not change much for the last 300 millions of years. Why not? We don't know. The climate changed, the environment changed, the horseshoe crab did not. Some of the scorpions, we have the perfectly preserved in amber scorpions, and we can literally get, well, maybe not to the species, but to the genus of modern scorpions. So they did not diversify much over a long period of time. Why not? Well, they're living fossils. Now, some of the lineage will change relatively quickly. Some of them will stay, not change much. Sharks did not change for the last 150 or so millions of years. Are they super evolved? Well, maybe, maybe not, but definitely could evolve a little bit better. The eyesight is not the best or anything like that, but they did not change much. And once again, all of that creates a huge problem for overall evolution or theory of evolution. Now, patterns in evolution. So some of those particular, let's say we have the arthropods. We have a huge diversification among crustaceans. We have a huge diversification among the insects. But we have a very small diversification among the silverfish. Everybody's seen the silverfish, right? Yeah, tiny little bitty pesky creatures running around. So those ones, we're looking at about 500 species. Whenever the insects are in millions, why some of the groups stay within a handful, so to speak, of species, another one went and diversified into a millions. We don't know, cannot explain per se. Then, of course, we can go and look at the extinction. Extinction is important, mass extinction specifically. So you can see at this particular time, bunch of different groups extinct, cease to exist. Some of them to continue, but many of the groups cease to exist. Think about 65 millions of years ago. A lot of dinosaurs and other creatures died off. Some of them survived, and now we call them birds, right? Crocodiles survived. Some of the crocodiles died off, many of them, and alligators survived. The lizards and the snakes survived. They were, but some of them did not. Dinosaurs did not. So in this particular case, this is the mass extinction. What's really happening, you can say, well, the mass extinction is bad. Yes, mass extinction is drastically reducing biodiversity initially, but often what we see after the mass extinction, we have that particular line, and then it's bursting into a diversification. So after the mass extinction, we usually have the boost in the biodiversity. And this is how essentially, let's say, mammals being diversified, and I'll show you the example of that. So there is several major mass extinctions. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 well documented. There was a smaller extinction between those. The Permian extinction, I already told you, that was one of the bad ones. 65 millions of years ago, the extinction killed pretty much most of the dinosaurs and other creatures, some of the mollusks, etc. And now there is a possibility that we're living in something which is known as the 7th mass extinctions, which some of the scientists saying that we as humans causing it. Are we really causing it? Maybe, maybe not. We're definitely contributing at least some. Are we the main cause? I don't really know. But during the mass extinction, in a relatively short, and by relatively short, we're talking about only, well, like, for example, here the Permian extinction was only 1 million of years during the explosion or eruption of that particular supervolcano in Siberia, by the way. Well, whatever it wasn't Siberia back then, it's now central part of Siberia, the city of Perm, you can look it up. So anyway, accelerate extinction rates, meaning that the species are dying off really, really fast. But if you look right here, 99, basically 0.9% of all of the species which ever been on this particular planet already extinct. So whenever you will find any kind of person who's saying we are so horrible to the Mother Earth and we're killing the species, etc., etc., you can say, well, maybe we're just helping the Mother Earth because 99% of the species already extinct. We're just helping to speed it up, those particular species which we don't like, or maybe they're not very well adapted. Cockroaches all over the world, tigers not so much, right? So anyway, what's really important that usually after the mass extinction, new species are constantly arising, and because we start seeing the available niches, roles in the environment, we'll start seeing the burst in the diversity after the mass extinction. So this is one of the major mass extinctions, and we might talking about the Cenozoic extinction right now, nowadays, so to speak. So some of the evolutionary trend, increase in complexity. That's a general idea, starting with Lamarck, that every amoeba is on the way to the human being. Not necessarily. We have a whole bunch of parasites which usually are simplifying the body plan, like arise of the viruses, how the viruses started. There is an idea that viruses initially were parasitic cells which lost most of the cell components except essentially DNA. So increase in complexity sometimes happens, in some cases it doesn't. And then of course we are talking about the evolutionary trends, like for example cephalization, cephalos means head. The flatworms come up with that idea, but they come up on it separately from us, the vertebrates. What is head essentially is, and please make sure you understand that head is the front end of the body which goes and starts sensing the environment. As a result, the front end typically carries a lot of sensory organs: the pressure, touch, the chemical, smell and taste, the light sensors, the eyes, and so on and so forth. But that's only part of the deal. Another part of the deal, if you have all of those sensors sending all of that information, you have to have the some sort of processing unit, brain, which will process and react accordingly from those particular sensory signals that we're getting, or the creatures are getting. So it goes in kind of correlation. We start seeing the increase of the sensors, complexity of the sensors. We'll start seeing increase in complexity of the brain, and the brain will be moved toward the forward part of the body. Why? In order to send the signals pretty much, or receive the signals almost right away. We still have the slight delay from whatever we're seeing. It's like 0.8 milliseconds. So whatever you see is already happened 0.8 milliseconds away ago, because once again, our eyes sending the images to the brain have to interpret. All of that takes time. So we live in a essentially past, but it's a very, very narrow past. So as you can see in this particular case, the cephalization, the formation of head, happened in the different groups, essentially separate. Nematodes, which is the roundworms, and the arthropods, they had the common ancestor, and most likely the head started to get, well, started right here, and then they split. But vertebrates, Not exactly. We're starting with the tunicates, which is which does not have head, but well, as an adult, they have it as the larvae. And this is where the cephalization, so the process of cephalization happened in the different lineages at a different time. But again, it's all based on what the which end goes into the environment. Same problem solved essentially the same way. So moving on, almost over. So evolutionary trend, we'll talk about the two-step process. Variation have to be, so mutations are random, and then favorable variation will be selected by the nature, right? Natural selection. That one is non-random. Mutations are essentially random mistakes in the DNA. And that particular mistake might give you some sort of positive input, and this is the favorable variation. Typically 99.999%, 1 out of 10,000 mutations are beneficial under these particular circumstances. 9,999 of them will either have no effect on the organism or will have a negative effect on the organism. So once again, we have in this particular case, natural selection works on two steps: random and then the preferential, non-random. And we already talked about the silverfish within the 500 species or 400 species and the millions of insects, even though they started with the same ancestor. And we already talked about another example of the process of evolution, starting with some sort of Australopithecus through the time getting into a Homo sapiens. You don't really remember how to spell Australopithecus, you can say ancient hominid into a modern human, all right? Or Homo erectus gradually evolving, not directly. It's not like Homo erectus and then we have the Homo sapiens. No, there was quite a few different species in between. But from Homo erectus into a Homo sapiens, that's the process. All right, change in diversity, we already talked a little bit about that, the extinctions, and then we're looking at the, usually we start looking at the increasing of the biodiversity. Already talked about 225 millions of years ago. We had one of the major mass extinctions, which are basically known as the Permian extinction. And in this particular case, lots and lots of creatures died off. And you probably heard about the Burgess Shale. It's basically a Klondike. Well, it's not Klondike per se. It's a holy grail of the paleontologists, because you can link quite a few creatures from there, and it's about 530 millions of years old. So available niches, again, availability to do something on the scene in the nature, in the theater of the nature. Now, once again, remember, no two actors can occupy, no two species can occupy the same role. Parallel, yes. Similar, yes. But the same, they start intercompeting, and then one of them have to perish or switch to something else. So, and here we're looking at the adaptive radiation. Look, mammals evolved around 200 millions of years ago, but by that time, whenever the creatures evolved, we start seeing, essentially, the dinosaurs were already in the full swing to take over the planet. They took over the planet and they had it for almost 150 millions of years, until 65, and our ancestors, rat-looking creatures, or opossum-looking creatures, not the opossums we know right now, but opossum-looking creatures, relatively small, mostly nocturnal creatures, lived in the literally shadow of the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs didn't give the chance to the mammals to proliferate, to diversify. Why not? Well, because there was no available niches. One of the most common niches, as you know, most of the reptiles are not active during the night, so the mammals become active during the night, which played a very important role in formation of the mammal brain. Why? Think about it. During the night, you have to have much higher senses, right? You have to smell better, you can have hear better, there is not much light, so you have to have a better vision. All of that, you'll have to have more acute senses. More acute senses will require a bigger brain to process all of that information. More information, bigger brain. So the mammals become brainiacs of their time. But again, the dinosaurs were happily chomping on our ancestors until 65 millions of years ago. Something happened. Most of the dinosaurs wiped off, and then the mammals like, nobody's eating us. And then look, we start seeing huge diversification of the mammals. Literally after this is the mass extinction of the dinosaurs and few other creatures, well, quite a few other creatures. And then in the next 15 or so millions of years, we start seeing the marsupials as well as the monotrons, and pretty much all of the groups of the modern mammals. The primates come out, the rodents come out, the primitive hares come out, as well as the rabbits. The carnivores showed up, and so on and so forth. So there was not much of the diversification when the dinosaurs were present because they were occupying the niches. And then no more dinosaurs, we start seeing, so mass extinction, and then we start seeing the biodiversity rapidly diversifying, or biodiversity rapidly increasing within the survived group. All right. And that's pretty much it for today. I'll stop right here. Of course, the video will be available to you afternoon today.